So to accomplish all of that, are you like stashing and popping things in the background like to like abstract away stuff or like how does that work?
That's yeah. There's a lot of stashing, reapplying, rebasing in the background to abstract away stuff. Like that's actually a good description of what's going on. Um, and there's multiple layers to it, but all right, at the core, there's the idea that if you do edits in place natively, you're gonna run into trouble. Um, like in my example, right? You move a commit to a new place and that's applied instantly. That sounds good, right? And I thought, let me just code that up. But you'll quickly discover that it may cause a conflict. I mean, of course, but what do you do then? Because when you have a conflict, in regular Git, you can't do anything. You have to resolve it now or cancel everything. But for Recon to be useful, that can't be the case. If when there's a conflict you're stuck, then there's a lot of things you can't do because you move the first commit and you're blocked, and you're like, oh yeah, but I want to make more moves. It's not, yeah. Whereas in the to-do list from the regular mode, like from the regular Git, the to-do list you can do anything you want and then you apply it. So if you need to make multiple moves, you do that. In Redcon, you don't have the luxury of saying, oh yeah, well we'll see later. Not in that technical way. So the core thing about Redcon is that it still allows you to make changes when you have conflict going on, when it's paused. I call that state being paused. So you move a commit because it is a conflict, and you're like, whatever. You move another commit and another one. Maybe you delete a commit, you can rename. Above and below, by the way, the conflict, like above the conflict, below the conflict, you can do all the changes you want. And then when you're done, when you're satisfied with how it looks, at that point, you start resolving conflicts. Although sometimes making another move will remove the conflict. Like you move one into position, there's a conflict. You move a second one that clears the conflict. You didn't even have to resolve that. So that's necessary. Like what I've just described, that's just user interaction, right? That's just how you see it. You're like, oh, I can move things even when there's a conflict. But then there's, okay, how do you achieve that technically? Like how in Redcon was that coded? And the idea is that Recon needs its own in-memory representation of your history. I call that virtualization. That's a bit like React's virtual DOM. That's very similar conceptually. So there's the virtual history in Redcon. There's an internal data structure that's really close to just being an array. That's virtual history. And so anything you do in Redcon, it modifies that virtual history. So you move so whenever you do anything, it modifies that intermediate trend representation in Redcon's memory, and then it tries to apply it to your actual physical repo. So if you move a commit, Redcon will be like, okay, here's a new virtual history, like it's kind of immutable in place, sort of functional. So it's like, all right, it makes a copy of your current history, modifies it with that move you've made, and then it tries to realize it, to make it physical, to see, okay, can I actually make a history like that? So Redcon will ask Git, like it's a series of cherry picks, basically, and to recreate the new history. And maybe they'll succeed, and maybe they'll fail with the conflict. If it succeeds, well, very cool. Like it's got a new head commit, so it applies that and modifies your branch. It applies your virtual history. It's physical now, and you didn't see anything, right? You moved it like it's instant. It's not something you perceive. Or if there's a conflict, well, then it pauses. So it shows you, and that's the fun part. If there's a conflict, Redcon's going to show you your history, like your target history, which you made. So the reordered one, which doesn't exist, it only exists in Redcon's mind, is the virtual history. But it'll be displayed exactly like your normal physical history. And it'll rewind time. It'll check out the conflicting commit and allow you to resolve it if you want, like a normal conflict resolution. It checks it out, it preps everything for resolution. So that's the core thing, right? Anything you do, it's applied to the virtual history, and then that may result in a valid history or not. If it's valid, it's applied. If it's not, you're in that overlay mode. You're paused. And when you're paused, you can keep making changes, and that's perfectly natural for Redcon because you're making changes to that virtual history. You keep modifying it. That's just, once again, sort of a big array in memory of commits. And whenever you make a change there, Redcon checks, is that valid? Can I apply that to the physical repo? If so, you're out. If not, you're still paused, and maybe you're paused in a different spot. Yeah, and that's really like a huge part of what makes Redcon, both the what makes it complicated to work on and what makes it good tool is really this virtualization concept, and the idea that Redcon is able to represent histories that do not exist, that are not valid by Git standards, and that everything in Redcon, every single feature, is built on top of the virtualized history. So yeah, wherever you're looking, whatever you do in Redcon can happen regardless of virtual states, basically. So you can even rebase, for instance, while pause for conflict resolution. You can actually push from a remote. Sorry, pull. You can pull from a remote while pause for conflict resolution. Like you're in the middle of a rebase and you realize, oh no, I'm missing that one commit, and this is the reason for the conflict. You can still pull, and it pulls, and it rebases on top, and that works because everything's implemented on top of that virtual history concept.
That's really wild. It's such a cool approach. This is like an event source for an event sourcing system for your Git history, kind of. I was trying to think of like the implications of that, and one of the things that one of my immediate questions was like, well, what if you muck around in the thing while it's paused? So it's really interesting to hear that it'll like pick up those actions and sort of like, insert them in the correct place. Is there a point at which you just have to throw away the virtual history? You're like, okay, you've done something and like we're down this track, but like we just need to like abort and go back to like the current state of the repo, or like unwind the virtual history stack or something?
I don't think so. I mean, anything, no, because like you transform the virtual history and it always represents something. I mean, if you, like in the most extreme of cases, you'll get conflicts at every commit, right? You resolve one and the next one's a conflict. But you resolve all of these in a way that makes sense if you can, and at the end you get an actual history that gets physicalized. Another extreme case would be deleting all the commits. I think that works, and that just deletes the branch. I mean, you gotta do something, so it doesn't make much sense, but you can do like Command A and delete it. That'll just delete the branch. Why not? And you make that comparison to an event source, and that's the initial approach I had was this, and this is why I used the word functional before. Initially, it was not in that functional idea. It was like a series of transforms. That was my approach initially. Anything you do, what I can remember is like, okay, from the initial physical history, you added this, renamed that, etc. But it turns out that was not as resilient. It was harder to code with. And so the idea now is that it really creates a copy of your history. Of course, there's a lot of copy and write stuff and all that. It's nothing crazy, but it's sufficient in memory. But the idea is that you just represent your history as you want it to be. A list of commits that can have virtual transformations attached, like rewording and all. It doesn't actually do them instantly. But mostly it's kind of stateless. It just represents the state you would like to get to. And anything, and so the key also is that anything you do in Redcon, it always gets applied to that virtual history. So in a way, there's no difference from going to a valid history, like you're currently unpaused, and you make a simple change, like you reword. Like that is the exact same thing as being knee deep into a rebase where you have 3 conflicts resolved and 3 pending, and you rename a commit at that point. It's the same thing. All you're doing is taking a virtual history, changing a little thing in it, and you get a new one. It's just that in one case, the virtual history is like instantly generated from your actual physical history. And in the other case, it was in memory already because you were paused with that virtual history.
I imagine there was a lot of crazy bugs to figure out in that, because just synchronizing states is one of the hardest things. I think one of the hardest things in computer science. It's like, just years of dealing with like, oh, you have like a server in this state and a client in this state. You need them to like be sort of have the same representation. This is like how many like millions of man hours have we spent just trying to, work through sync issues.
Yeah, I don't know how to frame this exactly, but yeah, bugs for sure, a bazillion of them. Actually, a very scary one. If anyone's thinking of actually using Redcon, please use Redcon. It's good. But it was really early on. The thing was weeks old, and it just wiped the entirety of a repo. Like a friend was trying it at work, by the way, right? Work repo. He had a lot of faith in me. I appreciate him. And it just deleted every single file in there. That was more than 2 years ago. I have a battery of crazy tests now. The tests just go through everything, like every scenario you could think of, and will. I mean, there's so many things about this, but like they test undo redo. So anything, they'll do like, oh, what if you modify this and edit this and delete that file and then confirm, and then you undo all the way to the beginning, and at every undo step, the tests will check that we'll rerun the asserts from that step. So we know that at every step it's exactly as we expect, and then they redo everything back to the end and rerun every single assert along the way. So yeah, like there's a crazy amount of tests. I have so many safety features that I've built up over the years. So some of them are for development time only. So some of them run at runtime. And actually, in that scary story I just told, at the time there was a whole repository backup feature. Like it would just back up everything, even the ignored files, every 15 minutes in a hidden folder, so that if something happened, you could recover. Because at the time, I knew it was very new and wild, and that was a risk at the time. So I had these things. So yeah, bugs galore. Yeah, and at the same time, there's something reassuring about it, because you do talk about sync, and yes, but also no. Very, very, very eloquent. The idea is that, well, it's back to that functional approach. You don't want to have to keep track of small changes and everything and deltas and stuff you need to do. And it's more about absolutes. You want to know what you want to get to, where you want to be. So, in memory, what is stored is the virtual history, like the absolute thing you want to happen. And that moves the problem. That doesn't remove it, that moves it. It means now the problem is having a correct absolute thing at all times. But that also means it can be handled differently. And so, like I just talked about undo, and that's an essential thing in Redcon. Like if you have the ability to just change everything, anything with just a click and drag, you definitely need the ability to undo it just as easily. Like it's non-negotiable. So yeah, undo, redo in Redcon, and it's pervasive. So almost anything you can do in Redcon, you can undo. So like deleting a commit, moving a commit, rewarding, but also like deleting a branch or pushing to remote. That one's a bit special, but even pushing to remote, you can safely undo. Like you won't override anything by mistake. That. And so the way I had to go to implement that, initially I thought, I'm just going to record the state of things whenever, like before the operation. So I was like, all right, to implement undo, I'll just make a big snapshot of everything before the operation and then record that data somewhere, and that's my undo stack. And when you undo, you go back. But then no, that's much too naive because of a bazillion reasons. The biggest reason is Redcon often doesn't touch your uncommitted changes. Like you can safely do all you do in Redcon, even when there are unmodified files in your work there. And like 10 things to say about that again, but yeah, that's the core thing. And that includes doing things like, all right, you have a commit, and it modifies some lines in a.txt. Well, it adds a few lines, it appends a few lines to a.txt. You delete that commit, so the lines, they go away. That makes sense. You go to your editor and you change that same file. Like in the middle, you change a few things. And finally, you go back to Redcon and you undo that. You undo that commit deletion. So you're undoing a deletion, so that's going to add some lines to a file that you've modified. That works exactly as expected. The files, they come back, the commit comes back, lines come back, and your changes in the middle of the file, they're preserved, like untouched. You don't see the difference. You forgot about them. And, probably most people won't think about it when it happens. They'll be like, yeah, I undid the commit deletion. That makes sense. But in practice, that means Redcon needs to rebase a bunch of things. It needs to take your changes and rebase them from the old head to the new head. So it's like a relative thing. It couldn't store the absolute contents of the file before the undo, because if it did that, it would override your changes. So instead, it's constantly storing things in an absolute form, but also reapplying them relatively to whatever's going on right now, because it's very delicate in that way. It's absolute in its storage, but delicate in its actions, always trying to change the minimal amount of things it can so that whatever you did is still there and preserved.